We continue with our comparison of the effects in the UK of utility scale, ground-mounted solar on farmland, versus putting panels on roofs. In our first episode, we looked at the impact of solar farms on agriculture. Now we'll explore how these two types of solar electricity generation differ in their impacts on Britain's economy, starting with energy resilience. One of the main responsibilities of any central government is to ensure a country's security and stability. The resilience of a country's electricity infrastructure is a key consideration. If an entire grid fails, there is an immediate impact on the economy and public safety. With increasing cyber threats, a centralized electricity network requires increased vigilance and mechanisms to ensure that the grid is not vulnerable to attack. By contrast, a network is more resilient if it combines distributed and centralized generation. Small-scale, homegrown, do-it-yourself electricity generation systems individually are not worth the attention of the cyber criminal. A grid that is supplemented by solar roofs is harder for criminals and hostile governments to take down. There is another advantage to distributed generation. Producing electricity where it is used, such as on this chicken farm, means there is no transmission loss. By contrast, the typical solar farm exports electricity to a regional distribution company or to the national grid rather than directly to a local community or business user. From a local substation near the solar farm, electricity is transmitted along high-voltage lines. The greater the distance, the more power that is lost. Also, some motors can use direct current or DC from solar panels, as opposed to the alternating current or AC that today's fridges and ovens require. The conversion from the DC produced by panels to AC incurs some loss. Using solar energy where it is produced makes good economic sense. One big difference between the electricity you generate on your roof and the electricity produced by a solar farm is the number of middlemen involved in getting power from a farm to your kettle. The solar farm started with a speculator developer negotiating a lease with a landowner and gaining permission from a distribution network operator to connect to their network. That developer conducts numerous surveys with outside consultants in an attempt to obtain planning permission to build the solar farm. If they are successful, the project is often sold to a company that will build that power plant. That solar farm may require a new rural substation. The cost of that new substation will eventually be borne by the consumer. The project could be sold again to an operator. There is consolidation in the operator industry, so there is a good chance that the solar equipment and lease will be sold again. That might happen several times over its life. Most of those operators are large offshore companies. Or that changing of hands can make it hard to figure out who bears the cost and responsibility for restoring the land at the end of the lease if the landowner by then wants it back. That is, if it can be restored at all. The electricity being generated is connected to national grid's high-voltage transmission lines or to the regional distribution company's network. During a 24-hour period, the wholesale price of electricity can fluctuate a fair bit as generation is greatly affected by how strong the wind is. That drives the wholesale price that the retail electricity suppliers pay, and finally you pay your retailer. With your solar roof, none of the costs of those companies goes into the cost of boiling your kettle, at least in the summer. In England and Wales, the national grid makes up £20 of your electricity bill every year, and your distribution network operator adds £100. On top of that is the difference between what your retail supplier pays for electricity and their price to you. Because the solar farm installer pays less than you would for panels, and because those panels are installed on a large scale, a solar farm's cost per kilowatt is half that of a domestic rooftops. However, with rooftop solar, businesses, schools, churches and homeowners have more certainty over how much that electricity is going to cost them in the future. Unlike statements being made to local planning authorities, there is virtually no local employment gained from a solar farm. Installers drive in from a distance for a period of 3 to 12 months. When it is in operation, a solar farm is inspected for damage by one person once a month. That person might live at distance and cover many solar farms. And periodically, panels are cleaned mechanically. It is solar installation and production on an efficient industrial scale, but as we saw in our first episode, they are being installed with 40-year leases on land that could be used for farming or housing. By contrast, solar roof installers tend to be small businesses, with most of their business centered around one county. They employ both skilled and unskilled labor. Unlike most domestic electricians, they should also hold certifications for erecting and using scaffolding, for safely working at height, and for working with high voltages. There are about 2,600 such solar installation businesses in the UK. There is a key difference between solar farms and solar roofs. Solar farms in accessible rural areas can damage the mental health of those that live nearby or those who would normally use those areas for peaceful walks. Mental health affects our productivity and our healthcare costs, and both have an impact on our economy. Loss of public amenity when rural public right-of-way footpaths with far-reaching views are turned into corridors hemmed in by high-security fencing is a typical effect on the landscape of new solar farms. Because of increasing thefts of solar equipment on such farms, designing out crime officers now recommend 2.4-meter high steel mesh security fencing. That is a significant change from the minimal deer fencing that is still typically proposed by developers. During a solar farm's construction, pile drivers are used to pound in the support structures for panels. Their hammering can be heard in normally quiet rural areas for miles. Pile driving takes place over several weeks to several months. It is like a machine gun that does not let up from early morning until evening, 5 or 6 days a week. In this particular case in Worcestershire, these machines have been used periodically over 10 months and sometimes 7 days a week. The council enforcement officer was unable to stop it. There is no doubt that climate change could have the most profound effect on our economy in this century if our planet does not get to grips with its consumption of fossil fuels quickly. One of the best ways we can do that is to be more mindful of how much energy we consume and whether we can shift when we use it to lower our dependence on natural gas as the key generator of electricity. By having solar roofs, owners become more aware of how they can lower their dependence on the grid by shifting their consumption patterns to more closely match what they generate themselves. That awareness alone can lower the pressure on the national grid and reduce our country's dependence on natural gas. That level of individual monitoring will not happen with more solar farms. Solar roofs represent visibly responsible energy generation, and that will help drive responsible energy consumption. In our next episode, we look at the comparison between solar farms and solar roofs from an ethical perspective.